Okay, I think I will go ahead and just make some announcements and welcome everyone while people are trickling in. So welcome everyone to our second talk of the semester as part of the Critical Development Studies seminar series. This series is an inaugural series which has started kind of this semester, and it is hosted and organized by graduate students in the Department of Global Development with assistance from our faculty supervisor, Jenny Goldstein. So I would just, before I hand over to Michael Carey to introduce our speaker and moderate our talk today, I just want to thank everyone for being here and also remind everyone about our third talk that will take place this semester on December 3rd. The speaker is Kasia Paprocki. She is an assistant professor of geography at LSE, and she will be talking about Threatening Dystopias, which is her book on development, scientific knowledge, and climate change adaptation in Bangladesh. So please keep that on your calendars. But that's about that. Thank you for being here, and over to Mike to introduce our speaker today, Christy Thornton. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Marvi. And thank you, Christy, for joining us today. I'll just give a quick bio and then you can launch into your talk. Christy Thornton is an assistant professor of sociology and Latin American studies at Johns Hopkins University, where she serves as a core faculty member for the Latin America in a Globalizing World initiative. She received her PhD from NYU in 2015 and was previously a fellow at the Weatherhead Initiative for Global History at Harvard University. And her first book, Revolution and Development, Mexico and the Governance of the Global Economy, was published with the University of California Press in January 2021. So without further ado, Christy, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much. I will just try to share my screen here. Hopefully everyone can see that all right. Try to arrange this so that I can actually see everyone's faces along here as I talk. Great, here is everybody. Thanks for sticking with me for a minute. So I'm really grateful to be here. Thank you so much for having me and for the opportunity to share some of the arguments in my recently published book, which, as Michael said, is called Revolution and Development, Mexico and the Governance of the Global Economy. Came out in January from the University of California Press. I'm really grateful today to Kelly for the technical arrangements here, to Marvi and David for the invitation, to Michael for the introduction, and of course to Dr. Goldstein for hosting us here. It's really a huge honor to be in Cornell Development Studies. What a kind of incredible program to be able to share this work with. So thank you so much. So while the book makes a couple of arguments that are situated in interdisciplinary literatures, particularly about Mexican post-revolutionary state formation and the construction of US hegemony, today I'd like to think through with you some ideas about what the empirical evidence I've uncovered in this book might mean for the way that social scientists and particularly development sociologists understand the origins of what your own Philip McMichael called the development project, right? What Gillian Hart called Big D development, which she defines as the post-Second World War project of intervention in the Third World that emerged in the context of decolonization in the Cold War. Right. So specifically, I'm interested here in the rationale for and creation of institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, the GATT, the regional development banks, the various UN agencies and NGOs that are charged with development as a practice. And that's the kind of thing that I'm calling the development project as a whole. So one of the main arguments of the book is that in contrast to prevailing historiographic consensus and the presumptions of a whole range of social scientific frameworks, that we find important origins for the development project in the relation between the ideas and actions of US and European actors and the demands of and organizing by Latin American actors in the period before World War II. So by applying the tools of historical sociology to the study of the origins of the development project, the book not only revises a crucial historical narrative to change the conventional periodization of what we call the invention of development and to reveal the agency of actors long relegated to the margins, but it also reconfigures our conception of the development project itself, not as a mere mechanism for the projection of US power, as some bodies of literature have had it, but rather as both the product of and a continuing site for struggle and contention unfolding through time. The book, therefore, provides a first step towards uncovering a genealogy of what I'm thinking of as developmentalism as internationalism. In making this argument, of course, I draw on the insights of historical sociologists like Andrew Abbott and Mustafa Emirbayer and Philip McMichael and others who are committed to kind of relational approaches to historical sociology. In fact, these ideas go all the way back to someone like Terence Hopkins, who argued in 1978 that, quote, our acting units or agencies can only be thought of as formed and continually reformed by the relations between them. For Hopkins, for example, core and periphery were not things in and of themselves, but categories produced by and remade only through their relations with one another. Similarly, though posited as distinct from Hopkins' intellectual tradition and methodologies that drew from it, Julian Go and George Lawson have recently elaborated a framework for what they call global historical sociology that brings together insights of historiography, sociology, and IR. I think that global historical sociology draws from this tradition that argues for this methodological relationalism, and that these methods can help us explain how the institutional apparatus of development could be understood not merely as a kind of substantial entity, a set of institutions, but rather as the effect of an ongoing diachronic process that is, quote, formed and reformed through interactions assumed to be with actors assumed to be external and subordinate, as Go and Lawson put it. So methodologically, this analysis is based on in-depth archival research in the United States, Great Britain, and Mexico that allows me to understand the construction of the development project and the institutions that govern it from the vantage of the relation itself, or from the outside in. That is not merely from the perspective of men like US Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, seen here at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, but through his team's interaction with the perspectives of the many others seated here at the table, right? Representatives of Egypt, India, Panama, Chile, and in my case, Mexico. We'll get to why Mexico in just a moment, and it's a really important question. For a long time, really until the work of my colleague Eric Helleiner at Waterloo, there's been a scholarly consensus that Bretton Woods, for example, was little more than a contest for hegemony between the United States and Great Britain, and that the multilateral character of the foundation of the entire post-war UN order was a mere fig leaf for US power, as Emanuel Wallerstein once put it. That the many third world actors at Bretton Woods or San Francisco or Havana didn't really matter was certainly a common view at the time. And many people will be familiar with the famous or infamous assertion made by the great British economist John Maynard Keynes, that because of the high proportion of Latin American states at Bretton Woods, they represented 18 of the 44 countries that were present, the conference was shaping up to be what Keynes called, quote, the most monstrous monkey house assembled for years. Keynes' colleague at the British Treasury, Sir Wilfrid Eadie, made the point even more explicitly in a message to a superior. In a document I discovered during my time at the British National Archives, Eadie wrote, "It's also silly to make the pretense that the Mexicans, even though their representative in July was, I understand, a graduate of the London School of Economics, and the Brazilians would discuss at the expert level a document which the American Treasury was endorsing. Their function is to sign in the place for the signature. To compare that consultation with the Belgians or the Dutch, which he seems to suggest we might do, is part of the gap in Dr. White's understanding of the practical way in which international exchange works." Now, this statement is perhaps only surprising in the bluntness of the racialized assumptions it makes vis-a-vis who is qualified to participate in international exchange, right? That a Dutch economist is inherently more qualified than a Mexican one, regardless of training. But the sentiment behind Eadie's protest here, that even a cosmopolitan, educated, elite Latin American appointed by his government to undertake these negotiations would be unfit for expert level discussions in the international economy, is one that I think is actually pretty consistent with the way many historians, sociologists, and scholars of international relations and international political economy have understood the so-called invention of development as a project born of the political and economic imperatives and planning brilliance of great men in the global north. My book joins scholars like Helleiner in challenging this view using a case study of one particularly influential state, and that state is post-revolutionary Mexico. We have to ask, of course, why Mexico? And my selection of this case emerged from the patterns of relation that I found as I began working through the existing secondary literature. So the book makes the case that Mexico played a particularly important role in the period under study because Mexican economists, diplomats, and political figures repeatedly assumed a kind of self-appointed leadership role among their Latin American and broader third world counterparts as they waged campaigns for what I call representation in international organizations and redistribution through multilateral institutions, elaborating a developmentalism that was constitutively internationalist. The book also argues that these campaigns were particularly influential in an unfolding relationship with US actors. And so that's not to say that the ideas or plans that I uncover here were unique to Mexico, or that a similar story couldn't be told from a host of other perspectives. One of my hopes is that this book provides an impetus to ask similar questions about the ideas and actions of representatives from a range of other places, right? Brazil, India, Peru, China, Egypt, Algeria, for example. These perspectives would give a fuller account of the relation that creates the development project. I therefore imagine this book as kind of one contribution to a collective scholarly endeavor to take more seriously economic and political theorizing in practice that emanated from the global South, processes that the political theorist Adam Getachew has recently brilliantly called world making. But Mexico, I argue, is able to assume the leadership role that it does, and their campaigns for representation and redistribution emerge in the particular ways that they do for three reasons. First, there is a long history of both personal connections between Mexican and US government figures, many of whom, for example, study in the same universities and work closely together. And what's more, because of its physical proximity to the United States, Mexico plays an outsized geopolitical role in how the United States approaches Latin America and the rest of what becomes the third world. Second, the ideological legacy of the Mexican Revolution plays a really key role in how Mexican officials justify their campaigns for representation and redistribution. Over and over, the Mexican experts I study here make recourse to their country's revolution and its social and economic ideas, particularly as embodied in the 1917 Constitution, as the basis for their action. Many of the actors I study here explicitly argue that they are seeking to create international frameworks of economic justice that mirror the domestic framework that emerged from the Mexican Revolution. Finally, and I think most importantly, actually, Mexico's exclusion from international credit markets during and after the revolution plays a really key role in defining how Mexico approaches the international economic and financial system. In 1914, Mexico defaulted on existing debt from both before and during the revolutionary struggle, and the post-revolutionary state would then spend the next 3 decades negotiating Mexico's reinsertion into the system of international finance, both public and private. The intense pressure that Mexico faced from US and European bankers and bondholders is evident here in this 1919 article from the New York Times, warning that Mexico, by sending this man, Alberto J. Pani, to Paris to observe the League of Nations negotiations, was seeking to have the quote unquote property doctrines of its new constitution incorporated into international law. When those capitalist interests organized into collective associations and allied with the more powerful states, they established real constraints on post-revolutionary state building in Mexico, and therefore shaped Mexican ideas about the nature of sovereignty itself. Isolated from international capital markets, even as other countries experienced a lending boom during the 1920s, Mexican officials began to theorize the insufficiencies of political sovereignty in the absence of economic sovereignty. Therefore, from the 19-teens until the Mexican debt is finally renegotiated in the 1940s, Mexican officials fought to create and reform international economic rules and institutions that would be fairer to countries like theirs. And a result of this fight and the relations it engendered between Mexican and US officials was, I argue, the development project itself. So I want to get a bit into the empirical evidence of the book. And to do so, I should say a bit about the method that I actually deployed to write this book. Uncovering patterns in the secondary literature that indicated that Mexico had played a surprising and important role in the creation and reform of international institutions, from the League of Nations moment I just mentioned to the Bretton Woods Conference, where Mexican Finance Minister Eduardo Suarez, who's seen here on the right signing the convention establishing the IMF, was offered a chairmanship of one of 3 commissions at Bretton Woods. So alongside the United States and the UK, you have the Mexican finance minister as one of the 3 titular heads of the Bretton Woods Conference. So from there, then to the forgotten advocacy of Mexican officials for a charter of economic rights and duties of states in the 1970s, that kind of bounds the book itself. So it was this pattern that I set out to investigate. And to do so, I had to not only get deep into state archives and the personal papers of key figures in the United States, Great Britain, and Mexico, but I had to triangulate between, for instance, their public pronouncements, the kind of speeches made at various meetings, for example, that are frequently consulted by historians of these periods, and the planning documents and private correspondence of these officials, both North and South. So reading these documents kind of with and against one another allowed me to directly study the relation in question, and therefore to see how this vision of US-led development that took shape when President Harry Truman announced his Point 4 program of technical assistance in 1949 was not a beginning or an invention, but rather the culmination of more than 2 decades of contention between officials in the US, Europe, and Latin America, and what would become the rest of the third world. So you can see here that the book examines this kind of longer period to understand what happens to Mexican advocacy for international reform once they do successfully renegotiate entry into the international financial system. But for today, we're going to focus on this first period. And I want to highlight some of the key moments where the relation I'm studying emerges as particularly important. So the first chapter of the book focuses on the way that the Mexican post-revolutionary state begins to approach international governance in both the negotiations over the League of Nations and in a behind-the-scenes governance reform effort at the Pan-American Union meeting in Santiago de Chile in 1923. These episodes represent valuable lessons for the Mexican state with regard to the perils and promises of multilateral governance, and also with regard to the power of those organized capitalist interests who, as we saw earlier, also make their presence felt in these kinds of negotiations. But the period I really want to focus on here today with you all begins when the Latin Americans begin to argue in earnest for the creation of what will come to be called the Inter-American Bank, which would have been the world's first multilateral development bank. So as Eric Helleiner has also written about, American officials had begun advocating the creation of an international financial institution that would provide regional governments and businesses with the necessary capital since the formation of the Pan-American Union all the way back in the 1890s. But it's in the context of the Great Depression that this idea really gains real momentum. So after being disappointed by the failure of the World Economic Conference in London in 1931 to produce any meaningful financial cooperation in the face of the global downturn, many Latin American representatives looked to the 1933 Inter-American Conference at Montevideo as an opportunity for collectively addressing the impacts of the Depression without locking the region into economic and financial subservience to the United States. Particularly cognizant of the way that speculative finance had rushed into the region during the 1920s and just as suddenly and spectacularly rushed out after the stock market crash, the Mexican delegation, led by Foreign Minister José Manuel Puig Casaranc, arrived in Montevideo with the intention of completely overturning the economic agenda of the conference. Puig argued at Montevideo for what he called a new legal and philosophic conception of credit, based on a recognition of international finance, not merely as a kind of technical economic science, but also as a reciprocal international social relation. Just as borrowers needed creditors to lend to them, Puig argued, the lenders needed borrowers to make productive use of their surplus capital. But despite this interdependent relationship, something that Puig stressed repeatedly, the poorer countries lacked sovereignty over their economic decision-making. So in this situation, Puig argued, the credit form itself had become an ordering principle for international politics, a situation that could only be reversed with the creation of new international and financial and economic institutions. So this is early theorizing of what would come to be codified as Latin American structuralism and eventually dependency theory, but it has not been recognized as such by scholars who in fact invert the causality here and argue that such ideas come later in response to modernization theories. Here we can see the development instead of a structuralist praxis all the way back in the early 1930s. Despite strong opposition from the US delegation, Secretary of State Cordell Hull, representatives of Mexico, Peru, despite opposition from the head of the US delegation, Cordell Hull, representatives of Mexico, Peru, and Uruguay introduced proposals in support of Puig's ideas, arguing for the creation of a new multilateral banking institution. Hull hoped that the US could overcome the Latin American clamor for a new financial institution and tried to postpone any real negotiations. After the creation of the Export-Import Bank in 1934, US officials would try to steer Latin Americans to Ex-Im loans as a way to head off further demands. US officials therefore spent the early 1930s trying to reject and deflect further Latin American proposals for a new development apparatus. But despite US recalcitrance, the Latin American campaign for a new multilateral bank would continue, and the idea was pressed again at subsequent inter-American conferences in 1936 and 1938, where the United States once again postponed the decision-making. But once the Second World War was underway, resulting in new restrictions on Latin American trade, Mexican officials redoubled their effort at creating the new bank. At a meeting of foreign ministers in Panama, Mexican Foreign Minister Eduardo I insisted on the creation of what he called an inter-American financial institution of a permanent character. And the meeting created this new body, the Inter-American Financial and Economic Committee, the IFEAC, which commenced meeting in Washington, D.C. shortly thereafter. I's proposal at Panama was then echoed the next month by Finance Minister Eduardo Villaseñor at a subsequent meeting in Guatemala. Villaseñor's proposal actually outlined a remarkably comprehensive development institution that was intended to stabilize currencies, act as a clearinghouse for gold and silver transactions, connect central banks to global financial markets, to systematically study trade and exchange issues, and crucially, quote, act as a channel for the investment of capital, which will promote sound economic development of the American republics. So here, a full decade before Truman's Point 4 speech, was a concerted Mexican effort to create an entirely new kind of institution for the explicit promotion of economic development through the planned investment of surplus capital from the global north. Now, while some US officials remained skeptical of these efforts, the strong advocacy for the new bank by the Latin Americans was beginning to convince officials like the Treasury Department's Harry Dexter White, who had already been advocating for increased aid to both China and Latin America, and he became convinced that the bank was actually in the US interest. So by the time of Villaseñor's proposal at the Panama meeting, the US officials had come to see the utility of the bank. It would speed up lending, it would better protect against default, and crucially, White argued, with a multilateral institution, quote, the charge of dollar diplomacy would be absent. So by 1939, the US stance had actually changed toward the Latin American proposals from the rejection and deflection that had dominated in Montevideo to now one of kind of co-optation of these Latin American ideas. Under White's direction and after detailed consultations, the Inter-American Financial and Economic Committee drew up a charter and bylaws for the Inter-American Bank by February of 1940 and sent it out to member countries for ratification. As Eric Leiner put it, this bank was, quote, the first international organization to be formally negotiated whose central mandate included the promotion of international development. And crucially, this idea emerges not in Washington, but among Latin American state officials. Despite the fact that a wide range of US government officials had come to see the utility of the new institution, however, Wall Street bankers and their allies in Congress worried about the competition represented by a government-backed bank, as well as the power to be given over within the multilateral institution to Latin American governments themselves. So bankers like National City Bank's Randolph Burgess therefore effectively worked to block the ratification of the bank's charter in the Senate, which prevented it from coming into being. By this point, however, Harry Dexter White had begun to shift his attention from the hemispheric bank to the new global institutions that would govern the world economy after the war, what came to be known as the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or the World Bank. While conventional scholarship on the creation of these institutions, written entirely from the archives of state power in the global north, has long denied any interest in development at all at Bretton Woods, new work, including my own, has demonstrated that in fact development was a key concern for White, precisely because of his long experience with the demands coming from his counterparts in the poorer countries. Again, because of this relation between US and Latin American officials. So we can see that White's experience with the Inter-American Bank negotiations, as well as the administration of the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which had actually negotiated a comprehensive deal with Mexico, these experiences had a profound influence on how White conceived of the new post-war institutions. Because of a close relationship between White and Mexico's Antonio Espinosa de los Monteros, who you can see here, Antonio Espinosa de los Monteros is an old Harvard friend of Harry Dexter White, who is referred to as Tony through the whole Bretton Woods conference. And he heads Mexico's own national development bank, which is called Nacional Financiera. Because of this relationship, Mexico is really among the countries that received the early drafts of White's plans and was continuously consulted throughout the planning process. So White repeatedly reported to Morgenthau about the Mexican demand for what he was calling long-term credits on concessional terms, and relayed Mexico's insistence on protecting the economic sovereignty of poor states as well as rich. But despite the close working relationship between Tony and Harry here, the study produced by Mexican officials, Victor Urquidi and Daniel Cosio Villegas for the Banco de Mexico in 1943, reveals not only their strong advocacy of the creation of a development apparatus, but more importantly, the extent to which they understood US policy itself and what they called the, quote, profound disturbance that the excessive wealth of the United States represents in the world as the obstacle to global economic progress. The Mexican study judged White's plans as immature and imbalanced, and argued that the success of any post-war plan would, quote, require taking very seriously the situation, needs, and wishes of the debtor countries in the process of economic development, anxious to accelerate their progress. As the Mexican economist Victor Urquidi would later remember, then, the Mexican delegation thus arrived at Bretton Woods ready to inject some interest in economic development issues into the debate. As I said, Mexico was given a key role at the conference, with Finance Minister Eduardo Suarez appointed as a commission chair, and Mexican officials, together with representatives of China, India, and other Latin Americans, argued at the conference for the interests of the poorer countries. The young economist Victor Urquidi argued in front of John Maynard Keynes that while European reconstruction was certainly important, he said, quote, in the long run, Mr. Chairman, before we're all too dead, if I may say so, development must prevail if we are to sustain and increase real income everywhere. As a result of this Mexican proposal, therefore, language was inserted into the bylaws of the World Bank, ensuring that equitable consideration would be given to reconstruction and development. Also, in the course of these negotiations, Mexican officials secured checks on the power of the rich countries to make decisions unilaterally and fought for representation of Latin Americans among the fund's executive directors. Thus, it was at the insistence of Mexico and other allies among the poorer countries that what Helleiner calls the development mandate of these institutions was codified. Many of the poorer countries were also adamant, however, that currency stabilization and long-term financing would be insufficient for their development aspirations if the key issue of international trade was not also addressed. Free traders within the US government approached the post-war settlement with the sole intention of reducing trade barriers, not least those that protected imperial preference for Great Britain. Officials like cotton magnate William Lockhart Clayton therefore drew up initial sketches in 1945 of both an economic charter for the Americas and an international trade organization that stressed the reduction of tariff barriers and the adoption of most favored nation principles by member countries. Approaching the Western Hemisphere first, as had long been the US custom, Clayton arrived in Mexico City at the 1945 Chapultepec conference, prepared with an agreement that would eliminate, quote, economic nationalism in all its forms and guarantee adherence to a system of private enterprise. Latin American officials, however, brought a distinctly different vision. Mexico's President Manuel Avila Camacho, who you can see here, opened the conference arguing for economic cooperation that shall, by placing limits of justice on the spheres of activity of the most industrialized societies, permit the poorer countries to use their available resources to best advantage. The Latin Americans therefore rewrote the liberal version of the economic charter with a distinctly internationalist, developmentalist vision that stressed coordinated international economic planning to level the global playing field. Where US representatives wanted free markets, once again, the Latin Americans insisted on the creation of an explicit international development apparatus. It's remarkable, in fact, to read the text of the final plan, which is remembered for the free trade intentions of Clayton and his team, but not for the massive developmentalist about face that the Mexican and other Latin Americans actually secured. For example, where the original Clayton draft contained a clause, that clause on the elimination of economic nationalism in all its forms, the final version not only dampened this, calling for only collaboration to eliminate the excesses which may result from economic nationalism, but also included in this category behavior ascribed to the rich countries, not just the poor ones, including excessive restriction on imports and the dumping of surplus of national production in world markets. And on the equitable treatment of domestic and foreign capital, the US original proposal urged the signatories to work together to ensure, quote, just and equitable treatment and encouragement for the enterprises, skills, and capital brought from one country to another, right? No discrimination against foreign direct investment. But in the final version, however, an exception was added, except where the investment of the latter would be contrary to the fundamental principles of the public interest. So this was a deeply developmentalist document intended to secure precisely those limits of justice that Ávila Camacho had argued for. And it's key here to note that this development project was proposed over the objections of these US representatives. As had happened before, the hemispheric exercise then informed the global negotiations to come once the initial US proposals on world trade were circulated. The first US draft of the charter framework for a new international trade organization was completed in 1946 to be discussed in an international meeting in London. While a resolution of the UN Economic and Social Council that had convened the meeting called for the organization to take note of the special conditions of the less industrialized world, the document submitted by US officials at London was in fact universalist. That is, it contained no differential provisions for the poorer countries. So in response, representatives from places like Brazil and India advocated strongly for protections according to development level. And as a result, during the 1946 negotiations, US officials singled out representatives of India, Brazil, Australia, Chile, China, and Lebanon as what they called, quote, crazy people for their advocacy of the protection of their infant industries. US negotiator Claire Wilcox railed against what he called the, quote, fetish of industrialization. But the result was the addition, at the behest of these poorer countries, of an entirely new chapter on economic development within the London draft. Subsequent negotiations in Geneva in 1947 saw a strong clash between the industrialized and poorer countries, which nearly derailed the negotiations. This set the stage for the debate at the final meeting in Havana, which began in late 1947, where the Latin American countries appeared to constitute what was called a sort of unorganized filibuster, in the words of one US delegate. The New York Times reported on a rousing speech by Mexico's foreign minister, Ramon Beteta, who you can see here, noting that the economic undeveloped and debtor nations were not fully satisfied with the charter draft in Havana. Beteta, for his part, argued that what was required was what he called a, quote, redistribution of acquisitive power from the poor countries, from the rich to the poor countries, and that the ITO was the institution that would oversee that redistribution. Indeed, the 4-month negotiations at Havana would be marked by the forceful pressure of an emerging third world coalition, which won concessions on tariff policy, quantitative restrictions, the stabilization of commodity prices, and investment provisions. They won so many concessions, in fact, that one British official argued that the United States had been astonishingly feeble in the face of the demands from the global South and from Latin America in particular. That is, while the United States began the ITO process with little regard for the question of development, it had been forced onto the agenda by the developing countries themselves. Now, as had been the case with the Inter-American Bank, of course, concessions by US negotiators could not guarantee that the ITO charter would be approved by the US Senate. And as had been the case in that earlier episode as well, US business interests stepped in quickly to express their opposition to the new development agenda contained in the charter. In hearings before Congress in early 1950, representatives of the National Foreign Trade Council, the National Association of Manufacturers, and the International Chambers of Congress all testified against the agreement, with the NFTC chairman arguing that it included, quote, concepts alien and hostile to American principles of trade and investment. Further, he went on, the charter as negotiated in Havana could be tantamount to, quote, the signing of a blank check by the United States in favor of other members of the ITO. If development was somehow an obvious tool to incorporate the poorer parts of the world into a global capitalist system, as some post-development scholars have argued, US capitalists and their friends in Congress had apparently not yet gotten the memo in 1950. Opposition to the Senate once again served to block ratification of the charter, and the ITO never came into being. Thus, the book argues, when Harry Truman gives his inaugural speech in early 1949, indicating that while financial resources that the South had been asking for were scarce, the United States was willing to share technical assistance, the book argues that we should read this as a reaction to what had become, at that point, a groundswell of organized demands on the part of the poorer countries for resources and institutions to promote development, for an internationalist development project based in representation and redistribution. Truman Truman's vision for development was not then some unilateral masterstroke suddenly creating a way of organizing the world that didn't previously exist. It was in fact a concession to the relentless advocacy on the part of officials from Mexico, Latin America, and the rest of the emerging third world for institutions that might address the massive imbalance of economic power in the world. Of course, from this point forward, Global South advocacy for international rules and institutions that would serve to promote industrialization and fairer trade, would redistribute Northern surplus capital, and would level the playing field would continue. And indeed, so would Northern resistance to seeing such a vision enacted. Global South countries would continue to come together, particularly at the United Nations, but also in regional meetings like Bandung, to codify international agreements for ideas like permanent sovereignty over natural resources, the economic rights of duties of states, and even a right to development throughout the second half of the 20th century. Those efforts toward an internationalist developmentalism, I think, should be read as a continuation of the earlier efforts outlined here, efforts that in fact imagined and demanded development as a new way of planning and organizing the global economy. Okay, so to conclude, this re-narration obviously provides important revisions to the periodization of the origins of development and expands the notion of who mattered in the process, right? Revealing the agency of actors like these Mexican experts who've long been relegated to the margins. But more important, as I said at the outset, I think this revision should push us to understand the International Development Project itself not as a mere fig leaf for US power or a mechanism for its projection, but as both the product of and a continuing site for this kind of struggle and contention unfolding over this whole period. Such contention, I'd argue, should also be the subject of social scientific inquiry and should inform how we understand what development is, has been, or could not be. How might this consideration change how we think, write, and teach about the development project? Most of our conventional accounts of our understanding of the origins of international development are fundamentally diffusionist, deploying narratives that, as Zofia Edwards recently put it, right, seek to, quote, locate the birth of modern ideas, policies, and institutional forms in the global north, and argue that these subsequently diffuse vertically from global north to global south. In this conception, the very idea of development travels, as one important history has it, right, from Western origins to global faith. And of course, post-development scholars are the ones who took this idea furthest. Wolfgang Sachs, for example, famously argued that the announcement of Truman's Point 4 program, quote, launched the idea of development with a call to every nation to follow in their footsteps through a mixture of generosity, bribery, and oppression. The result, Sachs wrote, was little more than an arrogant interventionism from the North and pathetic self-pity in the South. Social scientists across a whole range of perspectives have rejected the post-development implication that third world developmentalist thinkers and leaders suffered from either a false consciousness or a kind of comprador deceit, or that they were dragged into development projects only through coercive conditionalities at the behest of global institutions. But in allowing what Thandika Mkandawiri, the development economist, has recently called the Truman version of this origin story to stand against what he calls the Bandung version, which I have kind of laid out a longer history for here today, I think by allowing the Truman version to stand, we've not fully displaced the diffusionist implications. So I hope I've argued here today that I think a sufficiently relational methodology can help us to do so. So the steps towards rewriting the origins of development taken above reject a perspective that attempts to analytically separate entities that have in fact been historically produced and reformed continuously through relations between them. That is, I think it's necessary to study the history of Mexican or Indian or Chinese theory and praxis about international development and the International Development Project, not simply to produce more accurate sociologies of societies long considered peripheral, bounded in methodologically nationalist analyses and limited in synchronic time, but also to understand the important constitutive aspects of still unfolding global processes central to social scientific inquiry. That is, I think this re-narration is necessary, not just for a better understanding of the periphery, but for a more accurate historical sociology of these institutions at the very center of global economic power. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. We're going to have plenty of time for question and answers. So I think if you have a question, just go ahead and use the hand raise function or type it into the chat and we'll take them one at a time. Not all at once, though. Yeah, let's go ahead, Matthias.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for your presentation. I wanted to ask you a question around, you mentioned post-development theory and how it's, usually post-development has a strong critique to dependency theory because it kind of, dependency theory stayed in the framework of the development project. So in which way your re-understanding of this development project, reconsidering the agency of Latin American countries and their expert intellectual and all that, how can help us to rethink about dependency theory? Because yeah, they are talking about development, but it's in a way of thinking from Latin America ways to generate their own project. So in which way your work can help us to rethink about those theories that came after the period that you studied, but they are still a reference for a lot of us?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So, you know, I really take from the post-development work the kind of important interventions about the way that development as a discursive framework emerges as a kind of powerful narrative that, you know, elites from the global South take up as well. What I'm trying to argue here is that, in fact, that predates the kind of pre-existing version. So, you know, in some post-development theory, there is the idea that, you know, suddenly on January 20th, 1949, right, 2 billion people become underdeveloped in a way that never existed before. And what you can see here is that, in fact, actors from the global South are arguing about development and the sources of that underdevelopment, right, decades before the kind of decree that happens in Truman's inaugural. And so to me, that is an important way to kind of get out from under what I think is a dispiriting tendency in some of the post-development literature that dismisses these third world actors as kind of entirely selling out their countries and or, you know, representing, for instance, their own class interests rather than broader national interests. Now, I think that that can absolutely be true. I think we see that, you know, in a range of historical cases, and not for nothing that these Mexicans who I study here are among the kind of post-revolutionary states elite, right? But I do think that that perspective kind of blocks us from being able to see the extent to which those actors understood their place in this international economic system and were attempting to make new rules and institutions and regimes that would address that place, right? So there is not, so the kind of second intervention that I make here is to say, as development sociologists rejected some of the ideas coming from post-development to say, you know, oh, development had plenty of kind of there was a national impetus that we can see in various places, right? Where we didn't need the United States or the IMF coming into a place for, you know, countries in East Asia to take up the development project, right? It wasn't this outside imposition. Those scholars that work on the developmental state has given us incredible insights, but has assumed that development and the interest of the development state is sort of inherently bounded in the national space. And so what I'm trying to do is trace instead a different tradition, which looks not just at the way that development is bounded in the national space and is about the national economy, but in fact, the way that these same economic thinkers are considering how their ability to do anything in that space is constrained by their place within the international economic system. And so they also simultaneously undertake these internationalist projects that are an attempt really to put constraints on how global capitalism works, right? Constrain the power of these global northern countries, of multinational corporations, and that there is this kind of long trajectory to that goes all the way back to at least the 1920s. With regard to sort of how we think about dependency theory and how this fits in, I'm really interested in that question because, when I set out to study the kind of history of development and I was interested in Latin American ideas about development, I thought that I would set out to study, the kind of canon of Latin American structuralist and dependency thinkers. I thought I would go hang out looking at, archives at CEPAL, and I would be in Santiago de Chile or in Brazil or, in Buenos Aires. And I kept finding Mexico over and over and over again in these meetings in a way that surprised me, because there is not a kind of Mexican economic thinker, a theorist who sits alongside Fernando Enrique Cardoso, right? Or Celso Furtado or Raúl Prebisch. And so I was kind of interested in, why is that? Like, why is Victor Urquidi or Daniel Cosio Viegas or Eduardo Villaseñor not one of these people? And what I've come to understand is that the work that they are doing here is sort of theorizing in practice as they negotiate these institutions. So the publications that come out of it frequently are sort of position papers for these negotiations. When Villaseñor publishes about the Inter-American Bank, he publishes an article about this in English because he's trying to argue to an English-speaking audience about the utility of this institution. And so that kind of theorizing in practice as these ideas are being worked out in these negotiations is something that I'm trying to pull out as a kind of prehistory to some of the ideas that emerge in the structuralist project, and then maybe later in the dependency project. I see this more as being a kind of antecedent to some of the structuralist ideas. And there's an interesting moment, if you read the biography, the terrific biography of Raúl Prebisch by Eduardo Dosman, he points out this kind of really interesting moment that happens in 1944, not coincidentally, in Mexico City, where Prebisch has been, in sort of tense negotiations with the Argentine government, trying to figure out whether he's leaving the Argentine government. And he comes to Mexico City for a series of seminars sponsored by the Banco de Mexico with Victor Urquidi, Eduardo Villaseñor, all of these Mexican economists. And he narrates in his memories that these meetings in Mexico in 1944 were the place where he came to understand what the problems of the Latin American economy were, right? He realized that previously he had had this kind of Argentina-centric vision, and he understood Argentina's particular trajectory, but that it wasn't until that moment in Mexico in 1944 that he came to understand the kind of broader structure of the Latin American economy writ large. And so in consultation with these Mexican economists in these 3 days of seminars back and forth, right, Prebisch comes to begin to develop the ideas that will then be published as the famous 1949 CEPAL report, The Economic Problems of Latin America, that will usher in the kind of era of Latin American structuralism, right? So I see this kind of actual on the ground negotiation as this kind of theorizing in practice that leads us toward the kind of structuralist agenda. And I can see the influence of it on people like Prebisch in that way. So that's how I think about that. Thank you.
All right, great. There's I think a clarification question in the chat. Gennaro asked if you could detail what is structuralism exactly and how it relates to development. And then there's also a secondary question about how Mexico's collaborative aspirations have changed with neoliberalism. Yeah, that second question is a really great one, and I can address that later, maybe after Jenny asks her question, because it's important. The structuralist vision of Latin America is one that comes to understand, and this is the famous Prebisch-Singer thesis that gets developed kind of simultaneously by both Raúl Prebisch and Hans Singer, and they come to understand that the declining terms of trade for Latin America as primary exporters, right, mean that the sort of economic future for the region is kind of locked in this declining relationship where, because they have to import capital goods, they don't have equipment to make their own capital goods, the structural price for their exports will continue to decrease and sort of lock Latin America into a kind of dependent situation. So when Prebisch and what becomes CEPAL published this in 1949, it really begins a strong conversation within economic theory and what will become development economics about the ways that the deck is sort of stacked against a region like Latin America as primary exporters, right? So that's certainly
a kind of situation that, for instance, these Mexican economists are very interested in, because one thing that I don't mention here, but that's really important, is that Mexico is very strongly pushing for Mexico. What development means is industrialization, right? Is a very strong program of industrialization, and what they will come to understand after the failure of these institutions, the failure of the ability to kind of reorient the global economy in this way, is that in fact they have to pursue import substitution, and so import substitution industrialization and a kind of national and more inward-looking developmentalism is what will result from the fact that they don't get the Inter-American Bank, they don't get the ITO, et cetera. And so they're kind of forced to, in that way, begin to pursue a more inward-looking strategy. So that's how they then react to this idea of the declining terms of trade and the problems with capital goods imports. Of course, they're still importing the capital goods, but now they're using them to actually begin to industrialize, to do light industrialization anyway in the early periods. So that's the kind of background on the Latin American structuralism. Thanks for the question. And I'll come back to the neoliberalism question after.
Okay, great. Jenny, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Christy, for a really great talk. I feel like your book is already a development studies classic in the making, so it's really exciting to see. I mean, my question is actually maybe tied to this one about neoliberalism and really quite general. I'm curious, not being a Latin Americanist or a Mexico expert myself, where do you see, I guess, most clearly the legacies of this now, right? Or where are you surprised that the legacies of this maybe are not appearing, you know, to your perception? Kind of your reading of contemporary Mexico or US-Mexico relations?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And actually, I've been very sort of fortunate and surprised to that the book has been really engaged by the Mexican state. So I've spent a lot of time on Zoom with diplomats, particularly in Europe. Staffers at the Mexican Foreign Ministry have invited me repeatedly to these meetings where they're getting different people together, not only Mexican diplomats, but diplomats from Europe and from elsewhere in the global South, thinking about things like a framework for global public investment, for addressing COVID-19 financing, even addressing climate change finance. And so they have sort of very hilariously somehow discovered the book and read it for kind of lessons of a time when Mexico played this kind of important role in the world. And I think that that's possible because there is the kind of current government has a more progressive leaning than the previous ones did. I will say that, to sort of answer the neoliberalism question and this question together, sort of where this goes after 1982 is a really important question. So the book really ends in 1981, which is this important moment that is the Cancun North-South Conference, right? So as we move forward in the era of the new international economic order, there is this new kind of global South organizing within the G77, et cetera. And there begins to be what is narrated in the 70s and into the 1980s is this kind of clash between North and South. So, a series of officials and intellectuals led by German Chancellor Willy Brandt, try to overcome what is the North-South stalemate and write a report and say we should have a meeting where we bring together the leaders of the industrialized world and the leaders of the third world to kind of overcome this. That meeting gets planned and it's planned for the brand new resort city of Cancun in Mexico, which has kind of just become a destination. And what happens in between the Brandt study and the calling of the conference and when it actually happens is that both Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan get elected. And so it's Ronald Reagan who steps off a plane and kind of embraces Mexican President Jose Lopez Porfirio to kind of get at this North-South question. And Reagan flatly rejects this. He says, there will be no redistribution. There is no way we're engaging in this. Like there's no kind of further multilateral project to be done here. And he just rejects it. And Lopez Porfirio has this kind of sad quote where he says something like, unresolvable contradictions were raised at Cancun. And so there's the project really, I think, dies there in Cancun. And then of course, not long after comes the Mexican debt crisis of 1982, when the debt that Mexico took on during the 1970s, the thing that happens after this period is after Mexico renegotiates its place in the international financial system, it becomes a kind of model debtor and is very keen to make sure that it maintains its kind of standing in international credit markets, backs off of this very concerted advocacy and becomes a kind of protector of the status quo. And so in that way, they take on a tremendous amount of debt throughout the 1970s that they then find by August of 1982 that they can no longer pay. And so they threaten to default. And then what happens afterwards is the kind of reorientation of the Mexican economy toward the neoliberal project. There is a whole class and set of kind of domestic actors who have been agitating for this and who are ready to kind of step into this moment. But it is also led by these very institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the Bank of International Settlements, a set of institutions that Mexico has come to actually protect as part of this project that it set out to create all the way back in the 1940s. So there's a kind of irony in the book that Mexico is a kind of champion of reform and a very strong critic of the system as they get sort of more closely linked into and become a good creditor in the 1950s and 1960s. They become sort of conservators of the system. And then in the crisis of the 70s, they're faced with what will happen, in the face of this crisis. And the whole thing blows up and those same institutions come in and kind of rewrite the Mexican economy. So there is a brief attempt under López Portillo immediately after the debt crisis to organize what he thinks of as kind of a debtors cartel to get the third world countries who are going through debt crisis together to get together and kind of refuse payment. But it is very furtive. It has no real outcome. And what happens then is the kind of neoliberal readjustment and the Washington consensus. And so a whole different set of people take power in Mexico who are oriented towards obviously massively liberalizing the Mexican economy. So we get deepening structural adjustment as we go through the 1980s, and then obviously NAFTA as we move into the 1990s. So this kind of internationalism is something that I think absolutely disappears in the neoliberal period. There is the kind of idea that there is this everyone's converging toward the kind of Washington consensus liberal model means that Mexico no longer takes on this kind of role. So that I really see this whole project really disappearing, especially with the collapse of the North-South Conference in 1981, and then just being subsumed into the neoliberal project. So it's really interesting that now under López Obrador, diplomats in Mexico are once again thinking about sort of multilateral collaborative financial issues. It is, of course, the diplomats who are based in Europe and who are dealing with governments who might be more amenable to that. And so, there are some glimmers, there are some hopes, but López Obrador himself is not especially interested in the international. So the diplomats themselves are sort of pushing on that, but it's not a high priority for the AMLO administration. Yeah.
Okay, great. Anyone else?
Is that a question from David K or just a accidental chat?
I could jump in with a question, Mike, Delilah has one. Go to Delilah.
Yeah, so my question, the question I originally had has sort of morphed into perhaps more of a comment following your responses to the first two questions, but I'm seeing a lot of parallel in the way that you've sort of discussed the taking development as a relation in this specific way, in sort of the discussion that emerged following COP26 and the Pacific Island states lobbying for loss and damage financing.
Yeah. And
I guess, so I think that kind of gets at the angle that Jenny was asking for in terms of where this logic has sort of reverberated into contemporary development discussion. However, I guess like more analytically, I'm curious about whether or not the reading that you've offered sort of lends itself to insisting on the need to consider the logic of the development relation, or is it a need to think of the geography of the development relation, right? So a lot of the sort of ways you were pushing back were in resituating sort of where power and voice in orienting development was coming from, more the South. But I think when you were sort of parsing the details of that, it was in unpacking sort of the logic of the relation. So I don't know if these two things are inseparable, or if perhaps you could say a bit more about that.
Could you say a bit more about what you think the distinction is between the geography and the logic? I'm really intrigued by this. I want to know my answer to this question. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm sorry. I'm trying to turn my original question that got morphed into a comment into and I guess what I'm saying is like sort of how how you're complicating the fact that development isn't something that's just done to the global South, right? So that's like the premise of what you're insisting, but that it's also not necessarily something that can be seen just as a product of the elites across geography, that because there's a positioned logic from a certain sort of state circumstance with a certain sort of history, the claims made upon how to orient development become fundamentally different. And I think that I mean, the way that I'm understanding that in relation to how Pacific Island states are lobbying for loss and damage is that although this finance mechanism functions through the same sort of like pathways of adaptation, there's a certain sort of moral economy implicit in these demands for lending, so shifting responsibility about who is supposed to invest and invest where, and where capital flows are supposed to move globally. So I'm sorry, this is not very well formulated.
No, it's really interesting. It's very interesting. And, you know, what it makes me think of is one thing that I try to do in the book that obviously I didn't have time to really get into here, and that is actually incredibly difficult to do, and I struggled with. I don't know that I pulled it off in precisely the same way. If I had like 5 more years to write the book, I might have gotten better into it. But there is a very strong case to be made that to understand the kind of position that these general Mexican elites would take when they approach these institutions, right? When they approach a particular set of negotiations, that we have to understand the kind of domestic political economy and the domestic social struggle that is pushing them to make particular claims at any given moment, right? So it's not merely a kind of intellectual understanding of economists sitting around and reading and trying to understand why it is their economy looks the way that it does and how it is inserted into a broader global economic processes. But it is also the kind of demands that are being made on the street, right, by labor unions. It's the demands that are being made by, for instance, industrial confederations in Mexico. So there's this really interesting moment in the chapter that's about the ITO, that kind of last episode that I narrated here, which is one of the middle chapters of the book. There's a really interesting, when Mexico gets set to go to the Havana negotiations of the ITO, basically right before, the week before those negotiations open, there is a kind of massive and raucous street protest against the ITO in Mexico City. And it's led by nationalist industrialist confederations who want to protect Mexican infant industries, by Mexican labor unions and the Labor Confederation, and by members of the Communist Party and various socialist parties. So in fact, actually people like David Siqueiros and Diego Rivera are at this protest, right? Or are like arrested at the protest arguing against the ITO. So we have kind of protest against an international financial institution all the way back in 1947, which is kind of what my second book is going to be about how we should understand that history. But so I think that, you know, that kind of domestic political economy, domestic social struggle, you know, when the railroad workers go on strike and basically eventually the railroad and oil workers go on strike and eventually force the nationalization of the Mexican oil industry, right? We have to understand that kind of domestic political economy, domestic social struggle at the same time that we're understanding this kind of broader international relation. So the kind of entities that are in relation, that are being formed by the relation, are themselves being formed by relations with, you know, social sectors above and below, right? So just as in the United States, right, many of these questions about sort of protection, et cetera, are political questions about how these members of Congress understand, you know, the interests of the particular sectors in their states, right? So it's a really difficult balance to try to bring those things together, right? To do the international negotiations, the kind of high diplomacy stuff, and figure out what's going on behind the scenes, and then also connect that to the kind of broader domestic social struggle. And I try to do it in the book, I try to situate it, but I'm sure I don't get at it with all of the kind of detail and vigor that I could. And I think that's that kind of thing would also be pushing the sorts of negotiations that you're talking about, right? The strong advocacy from these particular places is coming from people from below are saying, we're drowning over here. Like we're literally drowning, and forcing their own elected officials to put these on the table. So I don't know if that's precisely what you mean, but that's what came to mind while you were asking the question.
Yeah, no, that's incredibly helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
David, did you have a question?
No.
Okay. Well, there's another question in the chat about AMLO calling for economic integration. I'm not sure I entirely know what it's asking for, but it says, where do you see Mexico in this? And has it been considered in the book or by Mexican economists that you encountered during your research?
That's an interesting question. I have to say that at the end of the semester means that I haven't been following this Three Amigos Summit quite as closely as I probably could have. But one of the interesting things that has happened during the AMLO administration with regard to North American integration has been some attempt to try to begin to address the wage differential on both sides of the border, right? And so the TMEC, the new NAFTA, really tries to put pressure on Mexico to raise wage standards to allow new kinds of Mexican labor organization. Mexican unions for a long time have been very sort of corporatist oriented toward the state. They've been business unionists. And so this, part of the TMEC negotiations was allowing new kinds of actual authentic labor organizations to emerge, which is important in the maquilas, et cetera, in the kind of in-bond manufacturing sector that dominates the border region. And so I haven't heard of any of the particular people that I follow here weighing in on it. Most of the people that I sort of follow in the book have passed away. Victor Urquidi passed away basically right before I got to Mexico to do my dissertation research. And I was very lucky to sort of sit in his office with his private secretary, and she gave me some of his documents to look through. But I was never able to actually talk to him. There is one figure in Mexico who is from the book who is still alive, and that's one of the people who's very important in the kind of later 1970s chapters with the establishment of the Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States. His name is Porfirio Munoz Ledo, and he's a political figure. He's not an economist. But he is now also a kind of member of Congress and a kind of strong supporter of AMLO and AMLO's party. So I don't think any of the people that I study here are particularly like paying attention to the kind of ongoing negotiations, but I do think that there are interesting parallels that, a kind of more progressive government and the institution of new labor protections, et cetera, that could bode well for kind of North American integration and for Mexican development.
Okay, great. Margaret?
Yeah, so this has been really interesting so far. Thank you, Christy. And I really, I'm actually TAing a course right now this semester, in which we're doing film writers book, and we're teaching many of the students the development as project ideas. So I'm so glad that you talked about that, because many of them were also here today at your talk. So the question, I find it really interesting how you've taken this idea of the development project and talked about it as unfolding through contention. And you touched on some of that in your talk today. And so I guess my question is a little more, and this may not be something you've directly, of course, covered in your book, but about kind of similar to what Delilah asked about, like the geopolitical location of certain nations in the global South and how they have been more influenced, like just kind of complicating the voices from the global South while taking them seriously, but trying to understand which voices from the global South count more than others, and how that has kind of lined up with the geopolitical interests of Western nations, and especially Western donor nations. And of course, this has been talked about many times, but I wonder how you think about how, you mentioned how the study could take place in other places. But like, how does the geopolitics of, particularly in the post-Cold War era, kind of influence where and how the study would be more tangible, and how the geopolitical location of certain places has come to play in which voices from the South count?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And, I may have made it seem as though that, if this is a project of kind of contentious politics between North and South over this long period, as though the global South was somehow unified, right? As though there was something called the global South and it had one interest and was unified in these negotiations. And that was certainly not the case, right? And so in every chapter, I trace the kind of, not only the contention kind of between US officials and Mexican officials, US officials and European officials, Mexican officials and European officials, but also within Latin America and then within the broader third world project more generally. So, even in the earliest days, the kind of first where I started the empirical part of the talk at that Montevideo conference in 1933, one of the things that the Mexican government comes to do there is to argue for a kind of debt moratorium that all of the Latin American countries will agree to take at the same time. The Mexican government comes and says there should be a debt moratorium of 6 to 10 years where everybody kind of takes a pause on paying their foreign debts. And they are pushed back against incredibly strongly by the Argentine government at that point. Argentina is the only country that has not, by 1932, defaulted on its foreign debt, although some municipal defaults had happened. And so Argentina is very jealous to guard its place in that particular moment in the 1930s as a kind of good debtor for the British financial markets, for the city of London. And so the Argentines hate this Mexican proposal and push back against it very strongly. And that contention is actually one of the things that the United States kind of plays up and allows the United States to kind of postpone any decision, because the Argentines kind of step in and they don't want that, right? That happens over and over and over again in the book. And so it makes kind of obvious sense, not only for what you say of the kind of geopolitical place of these governments, in the Cold War context, especially with regard to the non-aligned movement. That will be an incredibly important question that emerges. Will Mexico kind of join the non-aligned movement or not? And they sort of flirt with that and ended up saying that they are not non-aligned, they're independent. So they like non-align with non-alignment. And the place of kind of Mexico's relation to these other countries in Latin America and what becomes the third world is incredibly contentious. So the final chapter of the book traces the long campaign for the Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States, which is an instrument that people tend to remember as kind of subsidiary to the movement for a new international economic order in the 1970s, but which I argue, in fact, is the kind of predecessor and context for the emergence of the NIEO declaration. The charter fight starts earlier. The NIEO gets kind of worked out in the course of the charter negotiations. And there we see, for example, what the kind of more radical states, Algeria, Chile under Allende, Cuba, Peru under Velasco Alvarado, they are arguing for much more radical doing away with the system as it exists, right? They're arguing that the institutions that have been created cannot be reformed. We need to create entirely new institutions that get away from the IMF, the World Bank, the existing UN system, and create our own kind of institutions. And there, Mexico is once again a kind of conservator of the status quo and argues very strongly in 1971, for example, for keeping kind of IMF reform, for doing IMF reform and trying to get better representation within the IMF instead of rejecting the IMF and going off in another direction. So those tensions are incredibly important for the role that Mexico plays, and they are different in each of the historical periods that I trace over the course of the book. So that is that's a huge part of what's going on here. Thank you for highlighting it.
Great. Jenny?
Yeah, you've touched on this quite a bit, actually, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little more about your methods. And I don't mean in any sort of like theoretical way. I mean, really in just like, how did you do your research? And I'm sort of thinking that a lot of our students and a lot of our faculty, we don't, our emphasis tends to not be historical, but I think a lot of graduate students especially are always thinking about the archives, or they've come across an archive and they want to explore it. And it sounds like you've almost exclusively done archival work, or maybe you haven't. I'd love to hear if you've done other stuff. But as a sociologist, how do you approach the archives? Like, do you know what you're looking for? Like, how do you know when you found it? How are you analyzing these old letters? Like, that always seems like a bit of a black box, I think, to us.
It's a good question. So, I was trained as a historian. My PhD is in history. And so the archival method is something that we think about very deeply, and sort of not only archival theory and what that looks like, right, but what you actually do when you get to the archives. And I will say that it is certainly a challenge. So as I said, basically the period that I was interested in was far enough back that I wasn't able to do interviews with very many of the surviving players. And actually, Porfirio Munoz was incredibly important. And I was in Mexico City and tried to set up a meeting with him, but they were rewriting the constitution of Mexico City itself. And he was the head of that constituent assembly. And so he said, I'm too busy to talk to you about this old stuff right now. And so I couldn't actually interview him, although I tried. So the book is entirely archival. It's based entirely in archival methods. And it is based on kind of, as I said, sort of triangulating between these sources that come from the British archives, from the US archives, and from the Mexican archives. And I went some other places as well. I went to the League of Nations archives in Geneva, et cetera, but those were less important. The kind of actual way that I get at this was, I found in the secondary literature these particularly important moments, right? The kind of glimpses of these particular episodes where I could see that a Mexican official had played some role that the extant secondary literature was kind of not explaining, right? So when it becomes clear to me that, Bretton Woods is organized into 3 commissions, the first of which is headed by Keynes, the second of which is headed by White, and the third of which is headed by Eduardo Suarez, like that question was like, what the hell is this Mexican guy doing sitting at the head of the table on which the post-war economic plans are drawn up, right? That's not a story we've ever told. So the kind of one of the first things that I did was go into the US archives to look back through the Bretton Woods files. And in that way, try to find places where, for instance, White himself is talking to Mexicans and other Latin Americans and talking about what they have said to him, reporting that. So I was able to find important glimpses in the US archive. And I should say that a book like Eric Kleiner's Forgotten Foundations of Bretton Woods is almost entirely based in US archives, right? There are very few kind of archives of the Global South in that book. And he is able to pull out, even from just using the US archives, right, all of this kind of contention and influence from Latin America that others had just decided was unimportant. So that's it's a sort of lesson that I think about as a historical sociologist, is that when we use history writing, when we use the historiography as the kind of basis of our data to do our comparisons, et cetera, right? We have to recognize the way in which we are using interpretations. And so, in that way, the kind of extant literature would obviously argue that, Mexico's presence there did not matter. And so to me, it was really important to go back to these primary sources to rewrite that thing so that this might become kind of evidence that historical sociologists might be able to pick up and use as the kind of basis for this. After I, was sort of thoroughly into the US literature on a particular meeting, I kind of found these different episodes in the US archives. And then I spent, basically a year and some months in the Mexican archives, looking at the same meetings, right? Trying to find which parts of the Mexican state are engaging with these meetings. And so I spent a long time in the Mexican Foreign Ministry archives, and also in the National Archives, where a bunch of economists' papers are held, and the archives of the Colegio de Mexico, which becomes one of the most important institutions of higher learning in Mexico. And there I was able to see the kind of incredible thing about going through kind of foreign relations documents is that obviously the teams who go to these meetings are just producing massive volumes of kind of planning for them, right? And so the Mexican state in particular produces these really detailed studies of what each of these kinds of institutions is going to mean. They communicate with their embassies and legations all over the world. And that stuff all shows up in the archive. The economists do these really detailed studies where they argue back and forth with one another. And then I went to the UK and I found some evidence from these same meetings in the UK National Archives. And the UK National Archives are incredible because when a file is passed around, when there's like a memo about what the UK government is going to do at a particular meeting, it gets typed up and then it's put into a folder, and the folder has a kind of cover sheet on it. And every staffer in the Foreign Office who reads it kind of puts their thoughts on it. So you have these handwritten notes all over the top that say things like, well, obviously everybody knows this guy is an asshole, so we can't approach this way. It has this kind of very frank kind of language that you don't generally get in kind of diplomatic negotiations. So I then had these kind of 3 bodies of literature, right? I had the kind of front stage, backstage of each negotiator, right? Sort of what they were saying to themselves, and then what they were saying at the meetings. And then I had those 3 to kind of compare with one another. So the methodology itself is deeply comparative because I'm reading about this negotiation that if we just read, the kind of conference proceedings where it's like, and then so-and-so stood up and said this thing, and then so-and-so stood up and said this thing, right? That might give us one sense of sort of what's going on. But in fact, if you have the kind of front stage, backstage in each of these contexts, and you then are able to read those in relation with one another, it illuminates a whole set of ideas and particularly this kind of contention that we just wouldn't get if we only read the kind of the actual interaction at the conference as what was really going on. So that methodology obviously required tons of very deep archival research over the course of, doing my PhD dissertation. And actually my dissertation only went until Bretton Woods, until 1944. And so then I did research for and wrote a whole second dissertation basically. And then I had to squeeze that all down into one book. So then I had to cut a whole lot of that as well. And so that sort of triangulation of the public and private pronouncements, right, and the studies in each of the places was methodologically how I approached this, and allows me, I think in that is a method for studying the relation itself, right? You see how the actual positions of the actors, their understandings are actually a product of this ongoing back and forth that is usually highly contentious, even though the existing literature wants to tell us that something like Bretton Woods is sort of consensus, that the poor countries are there to sign in the place for the signature. This kind of method allows us instead of focusing on the kind of consensus of a US-led development project, allows us to see the kind of deep contention that underlies it.
Okay, David?
Yeah, I didn't want to ask this earlier because I was a little embarrassed that I had to step away from your talk for about 10 minutes, so I may have missed it. But one of the in talking about your method, it's kind of come back to me. So one of the things that I haven't understood so far, in the way that you're challenging the sort of reigning story about this, is what forces existed in sort of on the British and American sides that motivated them to, if they were in powerful positions, what motivated them to make concessions, if you want to think of it that way? And why didn't they just exercise hegemonic power and say no and not let people get appointed? And why didn't they live up to the narrative that is the dominant narrative of what happened?
Yeah, I mean, frequently they did, frankly. Frequently, they found ways to kind of push back and deflect and reject what was going on. But I think that there are kind of important hinge moments where one of the things that I think is interesting here, the kind of question of multilateral legitimacy is put on the table very early, right? So one of the ways in which the United States tries to legitimate its kind of leadership in the world is by arguing that it is this multilateral project, that it's not unilateral. And so, the attempt to create the League of Nations, there is some of that in there. And then particularly once we get into the Bretton Woods and the UN era, kind of having that multilateral legitimacy is important. And that is something that underpins the US-Latin America relationship from the get-go. And so that's why I focus pretty strongly in the early part of the book on these negotiations that go on within the Pan-American Union, because that is the existing institution, the existing multilateral institution in which the United States and the poorer countries are represented together. And that goes all the way back to the 19th century, right? So there is this kind of stage on which questions of multilateral legitimacy and the role that the United States should play with regard to the poorer countries of the world is being played out all the way back in the 1920s, 1930s, right? Particularly once we get into the UN era, there is very much a sense that, the idea that the United States is not just kind of unilaterally steamrolling, but that in fact, this is a kind of negotiated multilateral process, that becomes an important way, for instance, for the Roosevelt administration to justify their growing hegemony, right? It's very important in the close of World War II that they construct it's interesting, right? Like the United States emerges from World War II, the most powerful country in the world. Europe has been decimated. They could have just said, okay, now here's how we're going to do it. We're going to do it unilaterally. And instead they form this complicated set of multilateral institutions that in some sense should have to bind the United States to some of the rules that it sets in the world. And frequently what these actors are arguing for is in fact for the United States just to follow the rules that it has set for everybody else, right? So that the deployment of multilateralism as a tool to legitimate US hegemony is is really important and opens the space for this kind of contention where there is a kind of imminent critique where the Latin Americans are saying like, okay, this is the project you started, like you have to actually go along with it. And so there are plenty of times where the United States does just kind of steamroll over and decides to ignore its multilateral commitments. It decides to deflect these things. But I think the very creation of institutions like the Pan-American Union, like these international financial institutions, like the various UN agencies, creates the space for this contention in which the poorer countries are able to argue like, okay, if you want this to be legitimate, if you want this to be what you say it is, right, then, you know, this has to be an actual, the kind of sovereign equality of states that is so key to the Mexican post-revolutionary states understanding is really important. So it's always kind of how much the United States cares about that is obviously different at different times and whether the multilateral legitimacy really matters. And one of the things that I think is interesting is by the time we get to the end of the book, the campaign to create a new international economic order and this Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States really inspires a host of those who will become the kind of intellectual architects of the neoconservative turn in foreign policy to reject multilateralism altogether, to say the UN has been overtaken by the radicals, right? It's time for, as Daniel Patrick Moynihan says in 1975, for the United States to stand in opposition to the UN and to the broader third world project. So by the time we get to the kind of end of this project, the people who will become very powerful in the Reagan administration, Jeane Kirkpatrick, for example, begin to kind of push back on the idea that the US needs this multilateral legitimacy. And you know, the foreign policy that the United States has pursued sort of since then, I think illustrates some of that tension, right? The Bush administration wanting the UN to kind of sanction, you know, the war in Iraq, but, you know, being completely fine with going it alone if that wasn't going to happen. We're kind of living in the aftermath of this long fight over multilateral legitimacy that's happening within these institutions. It's a really good question.
All right. Unless there's one more question, I think this might be a good place to wrap it up. Christy, thank you so much for joining us for such a wonderful talk, and thank you to our organizers as well, Marvi and David, for picking such an excellent talk for all of us. And thank you all for attending.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really fantastic. It's really nice to meet you all, and I do hope we keep in touch.
Okay,
Thanks for joining us, Christy.
Thank you, Christy.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah.